rights-based
Well, first.
Great.
The way that
Sounds great.
traditionally get along with like co-ops and all the issues
Nancy has me,
and
because
think
I
the
kept
value
saying,
of the difference of meeting somebody
I
versus
didn't cover this. She said, well, you do it. So before I knew it, I was on
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming. I recognize some faces from other panels we had yesterday. I really welcome the fact that you're joining us in this Earth Democracy Conference. And I want to invite you to two events, in particular tomorrow. First of all, we're having the first ever in a state capitol rally to derail fast track and to stop the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement. And we will gather down here at 12:30 and at the patio in the foyer, in front of the foyer where you came in to register. And we'll march up behind the large Flush the TPP banner of the Flush TPP campaign. And we'll go up to the State Street steps and we'll have a rally from about 1:45 to 1:30 with some great speaking. And also we have surprise statements that we're going to read, that will be read, a statement from Representative Mark Pocan and a statement from Senator Tammy Baldwin.
Oh, good.
So this is very exciting that they're now coming out and have agreed to start off the summer and fall campaign against fast track and the TPP. Secondly, after that, come back and please join us in this room from 2 to 4 for a collaborative discussion among all the panelists who have been on the Earth Democracy panels and workshops in a discussion of powering up for people, peace, and the planet, the next stage. So what do we envision to be the next stage? What can be, what will be the next stage for really going beyond just looking at CO2 and trying to bring CO2 emissions down and somehow stop global warming from that limited sort of perspective and action, but how do we really build a climate justice movement that's very broad, very grassroots, much broader, much more diverse, much more grassroots based, and that really is looking at the issues of human rights, civil rights, labor rights, and earth rights, as this panel is going to lay out this morning to you. Please come to the other panels because we see those as leading toward the Saturday discussion. Hope to see you at both the events tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you all so much for being here bright and early on a Saturday, it feels like a Saturday, on a Friday morning after last night's festivities. I don't know how many people were up late, but many of us have certainly been burning the candle at both ends, but for good reason. So thank you all for being here. And I just want to give a big thank you to Nancy Price, who has done so much to make all of this.
Does everybody know you're Jill Stein?
I'm Jill Stein, okay. And I had the honor of challenging power in the last presidential election.
All right.
Which is something we all must do and keep doing every day. And as I tell people, who say, "Are you going to run again?" I said, that can't. The 2012 fight is not over. It just gets bigger every day. So we're all fighting every day, and that's why we're here, really to redefine the fight. The fight is, it's in our elections, it's in our communities, it's in our streets, it's in our workplaces, it's in our fight for water and for land and for food and all of that. And we really are transforming the economy, and we're redefining it. And in this plenary, we wanted to talk about what that new economy looks like. If the old economy, which some people call a free market economy, we could actually call it a predatory economy. Let's be honest. It's about exploiting people, human resources, and natural resources. And we can see, the brick wall we've run into on that account. We really are kind of at the end game right now. On all scores, we've hit the breaking point. So it's our duty, it's our responsibility, it's our privilege, and maybe it's our destiny that we're here now, it's in our hands to change our course and to turn that breaking point into a tipping point. So we are redefining the economy from the old economy defined really by corporate monopolies, multinational monopolies, corporate giveaways, Wall Street bailouts, and these so-called free trade agreements, which are not free. They're deadly. They're expensive and they're deadly. So we're saying we're going to leave that behind, and we're going to talk instead about what the new economy looks like, which is based on earth rights, on human rights, on economic rights, on labor rights, on indigenous rights, and on our civil rights and our civil liberties. And we have a panel here today, which is the Dream Team, and I'm so thankful to all of our panelists for making time and coming and helping to guide us, to help talk us through what does this new economy look like. So very quickly, I'm just going to do the bios that were in the in your program and on the website, and I'll be brief. We're going to give each speaker about 10 minutes so that we'll hopefully have time for discussion and questions. So Lauren Regan is going to kick us off. And Lauren is the executive director and the lead attorney for the Civil Liberties Defense Center, which has done an enormous amount of work for the tar sands blockade. And they were the first people I turned to even before I got arrested down in Texas to help stop the tar sands blockade. So big thanks to Lauren and the Civil Liberties Defense Center for making that possible. So they defend progressive and radical social change activists in criminal cases, civil rights actions, and SLAPP suits trying to stop activists or to deter campaigns that threaten their profits. And the CLDC, the acronym for the group, has defended over 800 activists in 10 years in cases ranging from civil disobedience, sabotage, grand jury resistance, police misconduct, litigation, and much more. And they coordinate legal support and know your rights trainings. And Lauren will be doing a training today, I believe, at 12:30?
Right.
Is that right? At 12:30. So really important stuff for all of us to know going forward. And they also monitor current government attempts to restrict civil liberties and dissent. So you've got your hands full on that one. Thank you. Let's welcome Lauren.
Thanks. So I started off doing federal environmental law when I first became a lawyer and challenged timber sales and endangered species violations. I live in Eugene, Oregon, so we're talking about the Northwest. And at one point we were challenging a timber sale, seeking an injunction to stop logging, and the court ruled against us. And my clients, who are environmental groups, invited me out to do media with them in the middle of the woods. And when I got there, I noticed my clients were all locked underneath logging trucks, and throughout the day were extracted and put in paddy wagons and driven away to jail. And at that point I decided, after watching the representation that they received and the type of experience they had in the court system, that more than ever activists deserve the highest caliber representation. Because for so many activists these days, the front lines often ends up in a jail cell. And for people who are willing to risk their liberty for a cause that they believe in, they need lawyers who are willing to stand elbow to elbow with them and treat them as political activists and political people, even when they're in the court system. And so I started representing activists at that point in time. And since then, we've had to kind of expand our repertoire to include representing activists who are victims of police misconduct, as well as government misconduct. We sue cops for excessive force, and we sue the government for unlawful spying of activist groups. And I've represented activists all across the spectrum, from Quaker Friends meetings to Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front underground activists. And one of the things that I think that we all kind of need to keep in the back of our heads, and I think a big part of the undercurrent of this conference is the importance of solidarity. I work with Native American tribes, I work with Black Panthers, I work with Muslim communities, radical environmental and animal rights communities, labor groups, and I go in kind of as this lawyer specialist. I go in and I train activists on what their rights are when they're interacting with cops and the government, what the First Amendment is supposed to allow, what words to use when you are out on the streets interacting with cops, and what to expect if you get arrested, so that people can make knowing, voluntary decisions about the risks that they're going to take before they take them. And so in doing that, I get to kind of have my hands in a bunch of different pies. I don't have to pick one movement or one cause, and as a result of that, I really see from an interesting vantage point the incredible importance of intersectionality and cross-movement work and solidarity within those movements. And solidarity goes beyond just sort of saying, yeah, I agree with that cause. It also means solidarity is not shit-talking other people's tactics, for instance. We need all the tools in the toolbox at this point in the fight. And oftentimes I see, even environmentalists not able to work together because they define the word violence differently, or, saying naughty things to police officers is not acceptable as a tactic and whatnot. And I think it's really important to remember that what unites us is much more powerful than what divides us. And the climate justice movement is one of those causes. For instance, I just am coming from Utah. We just did an action camp with a bunch of indigenous people, with the largest group of undocumented activists I've ever given Know Your Rights trainings to. We actually had a special team of legal observers to keep eyes on all the undocumented people that went out with us to stop tar sands mining, the first U.S. tar sands mine in Canyon Country, Utah. We went out there and activists completely stopped mining and construction for the entire day. And I would say probably a third of those people were risking deportation as a result of being there. And I think it was an incredible example of how the climate justice movement really can serve to be a large umbrella, and how important civil rights are throughout this whole thread. Tomorrow during the plenary, I'll talk a little more about my work in coordinating legal support for the entire tar sands resistance movement nationwide. And there are many different places sprouting up around the country that are doing tar sands work, but they all are facing the same things, and that is massive corporations. Massive corporations trying to repress their ability to dissent against their profiteering, police who are in bed with those corporations, and we actually had an experience where the Trans-Canada representative walked up to local sheriffs after a day of tasing and macing nonviolent activists and said, "Good job today, we'll make sure and replace all your OC spray so you'll have more of it for the next time." So the amount of cooperation between government and corporations from my vantage point is staggering, and hopefully we'll have more time to talk about it during the discussion.
Lauren, keep going. Actually, that was just a signal to Sherry to be next up.
Oh,
But
okay.
you've got 5 more minutes.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you. Sorry.
All right, I was going to say, wow, I really went off on a tangent, I guess. Well, so anyway, what I was about to go into a little more detail, to use tar sands as kind of a clear example, I will go into a community. Oftentimes, people have never even held a protest sign, let alone organized a campaign, and let alone a nonviolent campaign. And we'll go in and we'll do Know Your Rights trainings, the type that I'll give this afternoon. We will talk about strategic planning and how to build a campaign and how to do outreach. And I think a lot of local folks that become passionate about an issue, that's almost an instinct to be able to do some of those things. But the other thing we have to do in a lot of the communities is also train the police, because they've never seen protest before, and especially, for example, in Texas, they were not very good to those activists. We had people who were locked down to pipes and equipment, and law enforcement repeatedly used tasers on them. If you don't know, tasers send electricity through the body and make you go rigid. If you're locked into metal equipment and the current is going through it, it's a deadly situation. And the police there had never used their tasers. TransCanada had provided tasers to them, and TransCanada stood by with a video camera and watched the whole shebang. So right after that happened, the first thing I had to do is write letters to every county sheriff's department saying, hello, I'm going to sue your ass if you ever do this again. Here's the law. Well, you should learn it. You should know it as a law enforcement officer, but apparently they never taught you that. And we're going to sue you, for what you just did to those activists, with the hope of being able to kind of rein them in. What happens shortly after that is folks are arrested, and then the local cops and prosecutors' offices take the list of arrested people and give it to TransCanada's corporate people, so that then TransCanada can file SLAP suits against the activists. SLAP stands for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. It's when corporations sue activists in their campaigns to basically try to kill the campaign and to censor them. TransCanada tried to get an injunction against the tar sands blockade, saying that they couldn't talk negatively about TransCanada and the pipeline, couldn't even put anything on a website talking about the issues underlying. And of course, we beat that back and we won that, but that was what they were going for. That was their goal, to basically silence their enemies, and they do it with incredible amounts of money. They pour them into the police departments, they pour them into the prosecution offices, and these, neutral community safety entities literally become the lapdogs of these corporations. And then, even worse, when we get to court with these activists, especially in Texas, but lots of other places, we realize that the judges, and in Texas, there are some very interesting judges. But in Texas, all of the judges, their PERS, their pensions, their retirement, are all funded by oil and gas. And so to be an activist fighting against oil and gas in that state means that you don't have a friendly face to look at in the entire state in terms of once you are in the system. But despite all of that, these folks have mobilized communities that are rural, are poor, are as Republican or Tea Party as you want to go, and because they have an issue in common and because they have a common enemy, they've been able to really mobilize those communities and do as much as they possibly can. Now that pipeline's in the ground right now. There's about to be another lawsuit filed because we actually had activists that climbed into the pipe and blockaded themselves in the pipe with video cameras, and they actually were able to film giant cracks going all across the wells of these pipes. And soon, the most toxic form of tar sands crude will be pumping through them at extremely high rates of speed and heat, with all sorts of unknown chemicals added to them to liquefy it enough to push it through this pipe. These pipelines, especially in Texas, go like this because they zigzag, because they avoid white rich neighborhoods and they go through poor communities of color. There's actually a pipeline that goes about this far away from a Head Start playground in a brown community, basically. And so those communities are going to be, at grave risk if this crude, if this tar sands oil ever starts flowing through the pipe. So luckily, a bunch of TransCanada workers, subcontractors, have become whistleblowers on all of the shortcuts and shoddiness that has gone on down there. But once it's in the ground, once it's buried, once all the forests are clear-cut, and these communities have already been devastated, the idea that Obama is not going to sign on the line and let that stuff start flowing seems unbelievable to me. I mean, I want to be optimistic, but I think that, the fight is not over, the war has just begun, and, I think that we've got a lot more work to do in those types of communities, and there are a lot of civil rights battles to be had yet.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So it's really nice to know that you have a good team of lawyers that has your back. So, much appreciation. Thank you, Lauren. Our next speaker is Sherry Mitchell, next in line also, who was born and raised on the Penobscot Indian Reservation in Maine. Is that right? Yeah. And she has a law degree and a certificate in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy from the University of Arizona's James Rogers School of Law. She's licensed to practice in Maine and several tribal courts. She's advocated for Native American rights over about 20 years and for international indigenous rights for the last 5 years. She's received the Mahoney Dunn International Human Rights and Humanitarian Award in 2010, congratulations, for research into nation-state complicity with human rights violations against indigenous people. And currently she is the executive director of the Land Peace Foundation for the protection of indigenous lands and sacred sites. And that work plays such an important role, I think, not only in protecting the heritage of the Indian nations, of the First Nations, but really in protecting the heritage of all of us and our future. It's our past as well as our future. So I really want to thank Sherry for her work and for sharing that with us today.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you all for coming here to participate in this very important discussion. This morning I'd like to talk to you about the nexus between environmental justice, indigenous land rights, and human survival. And I think that all of us know that this is more than the issue of the day. This is really the issue of our time. And so a lot of the work that Lauren does, there's a lot of overlap with some of the work that I do. So I'm not going to go into great detail about those things, but what I would like to talk to you about is the fact that, all across the globe there are battles going on right now over land and water. And at the heart of the majority of those battles there are indigenous people. And they're struggling to hold on to their land not only for their own people, but for the planet, for life on this planet. The Indigenous Lifeway is really grounded in an awareness of deep connectivity to all creation. And I think that there's an inherent understanding, I was certainly raised with an inherent understanding, that the well-being of each individual is really reflective of the well-being of the whole. And so there's a lot of things going on right now that are evidence that our well-being is in jeopardy, certainly. As a result of that understanding, Indigenous people often see themselves as an extension of the land. For instance, when I'm asked what tribe I come from and where I live, I can answer with one word. That word is Bunawabskek in my language. Bunawabskek is the name of the people, the tribe, Penobscot. In our language, it's pronounced Bunawabskek. And the place is also Bunawabskek. And it literally translated means the place where the white rocks come out of the water. And so we're on an island in the Penobscot River that's flanked on the east side by a series of whitewater rapids. And so the name of the river is also Bunawabskek. So the people, the place, and those waters are all inherently connected, intertwined, and indistinguishable by name. And so that's how we really understand that our sense of place is deeply connected to who we are. So when we start looking at the larger issue in relation to those understandings, I think that it's understandable why Indigenous people have been speaking for the land since the moment of first contact. And so there are a number of Native people that are currently out there speaking for the land right now. And I think that the importance of that is coming to a head at this time. This is why we're at this nexus point, because it's almost become this cliched cultural attribute that Indigenous people speak for the land. People don't listen, they ignore it. And so right now we're at a place where the destruction that has occurred on Indigenous lands is starting to spill into the commons. So the things that have been reserved for the fringe communities, the Native communities, and the people in Appalachia, those things are starting to spill into the commons. And so people can no longer ignore that voice. And so there have been many people throughout history who have said that if you look at the treatment of Indigenous people, that it's really the miner's canary. But nobody paid attention when those people were choking on the toxins that were being dumped on them. And so now people in Middle America are starting to experience the things that Indigenous people have been experiencing for decades. And that's why I'm here to talk to you today, because now is a natural moment for us to become friends. It's a natural moment for us to unite, to bring those issues together. And one of the things that I want to stress here in the short time, and I want to try to be quick because I do want to leave time for questions at the end, and I want to show you a couple of little things that relate to the work that I'm doing right now. But right now, some of the last remaining lands that are untouched on this planet are in the hands of Indigenous people. And so this puts us in a unique position to stand against the destruction that we're all witnessing. So the treaty, statutory, and Aboriginal title rights possessed by Indigenous people provide one of the greatest hopes for asserting standing to challenge the unchecked destruction of our ecosystems. So whereas other groups may not have standing to stand up and challenge those issues, Indigenous people do have standing because they have certain rights to the land that are unique. And so again, forming those alliances becomes really, really critical because people have largely ignored Indigenous land rights issues. And so the importance of really connecting to those battles and to standing behind Indigenous people at this time is crucial, not only for Indigenous people, but for the planet. And so we can no longer ignore what's going on. And I think that this is something that is beneficial to everyone. And we're talking about people, peace, and the planet. There is another friend of mine that's speaking at this conference. His name is Paul Chappell. He's wrote this several amazing books. His most recent one is The Art of Waging Peace. And he has a quote in there, the story that I told him. There was an elder that I met about 20 years ago named Thomas Binyaka, who was a Hopi elder. And Thomas Binyaka told me the story sitting around a fire one night at this elders gathering that always stuck with me, and now it seems to be everywhere, this story, about the Rainbow Warriors. And so what that story tells us is that each direction in our culture has a color associated with it. And then all the races of people have colors associated with them. And so that people from all of the different directions, from all of the different races would rise up at a time of extreme crisis for the planet and would unite. And that's the story of the Rainbow Warriors. And I think that that's what we're seeing right now. That it's really timely that we are all coming together in a way that's different from the ways that we've come together before, because we have come together before, but almost in an exploitive sort of way. You know, well, you're a good poster child for my movement, so I'm going to use you, and then when I get what I want, I'm going to throw you to the side. But people are coming together in very different ways because we can all tell that what's going on right now is crucial. There is no mistaking that we're all in real danger if we don't do something about this. And so unless we begin to heal our relationship with the earth, everything that we do is going to be triage. It's simply an emergency measure to keep us alive in the short term, but it promises us no long-term stability or long-term sustainability. So if you really look at the Indigenous Lifeway and look at what the Indigenous people have been doing, it really is the first green, sustainable economy that's existed on this continent. And it's a great model. But it's also the resources that we have through the rights that are available to Native people is an incredible tool to be used to slow the momentum enough for us to be able to get some type of alternative solutions in place. So I'm hoping that we can all begin to really build those relationships in meaningful ways, that people will start paying attention, because when you hear about an Indigenous land rights battle, you can bet that if those lands are taken away from the Native peoples, they're going to end up in the hands of industry. That is what happens every single time, without fail. So I'm just going to quickly show you where the focus of my work has been lately. So my tribe, the Penobscot tribe, is here. And we're part of a confederation of tribes. Most people have heard of the Iroquois Confederacy. Well, they're here. And this is the Wabanaki Confederacy. The Wabanaki are the people of the Don. Wabanaki means people of the Don. And so it's the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Mi'kmaq, and the Maliseet. And so they runs through upper New England and into the Canadian Maritimes, and a lot of our tribes are border tribes. So our lands cross the border in several locations. The majority of the work that I do is related to border crossing issues. And so really notice in relation to the state of Maine where all of this happens, because one of the things that is going to be talked about in one of the sessions today is this east-west corridor that they want to put down through the center of the state. And that is a public-private partnership. And what they did with that was they created, well, the Maine legislature passed a law saying that any project that's covered under these public-private partnerships doesn't have to be subject to FOIA requests. And so if you know anything about the law, if you invest a certain amount of money where you get to a tipping point, it's considered to be inequitable to stop the project from going forward. So that's a really creative strategy for them to be able to do everything under the ground, invest a ton of money up front, get to the place where they can go into court and say, we've already invested $15 million, we're going to lose all that if you don't let us go forward. And then they're able to push their project forward. And so people in Maine have really been standing up and fighting against that, and there are people who are currently drafting new laws to try to overturn that. But just pay attention to this area right here. And so you've probably heard that they just approved the west to east pipeline project in Canada because they weren't able to get down through the west because of the fantastic job that people in the west are doing to stop them from coming through. And so this is the state of Maine, and this is the plan for the new extension to the pipeline to go up here right over to the bay in St. John. And so the east-west corridor conveniently will go right down through the state if that's approved. And so there's nobody that believes that they're not going to put a pipeline in there. And so all of these lands here are subject to this pipeline, but they're also, they have thumpers in through that territory to test for the viability of fracking. And there's a community up here, Tobic, and right outside of that community there's a nuclear power plant. And where they're planning to frack is in an area where there's a fault line that runs right through that community and right underneath that plant. And so people have been standing in the way of the thumpers that have been coming through there. There have been dozens of indigenous people that have been arrested, and they're on their own lands. And so they're not arresting any of the allies, they're only arresting the Native people because nobody pays attention to what happens to Native people. It's an invisible population. And so they're very strategic, as Lauren said, about how they do things. We're working right now they actually have pulled out for the moment, but we know that they'll be back. And there's another community kind of in this area where they're already fracking right up to the edge of the Native community. And in the past year, more than 30 people have died of very aggressive rare forms of cancer. And in a small Native community, you're talking about 10% of the population. And so a lot of these things that are happening on Native lands. And so we're going to talk about some of the other, well, I'm going to talk about some of the other things that we're doing in the next session on guardianship and writing earth rights into law. And then I'm going to be speaking this afternoon on an I Don't Know More panel where I'll talk in greater detail about some of the things that are going on up here, but to be mindful of time, I'm going to close with that and hope to have continued discussions with you throughout the time. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jerry. That was very inspiring. And I would just add that in the way that the First Nations have sort of create a model for a sustainable economy and sustainable land use, they've also provided an incredible model of courage in standing their ground in the way that our ground should be stood. Yeah. And I think that we all take enormous strength from following that model and the courage of your actions. So thank you so much. So Ruth, we're going to jump to you next, and Ruth is going to talk about sort of corporate rights as opposed to all the other rights that we want to create the basis for a new economy. Ruth is going to tell us a little bit about how we fight back against the corporate rights that are the underpinnings of this current predatory economy. And she began her environmental career with a decade of organizing and litigating successfully, preventing construction of 3 nuclear power units on Lake Ontario, thank you for that, followed by a decade as a safe energy lobbyist and executive director of Environmental Action. And that's a national grassroots organization. And later she coordinated the Interdisciplinary Economic Working Group, which developed a community-centered system for full employment and local sustainability. She won the Sierra Club's 2004 Special Service Award for her work on corporate accountability, international trade, water privatization, and energy policy. And currently she's the national coordinator for the Alliance for Democracy's Defending Water for Life campaign. Let's welcome Ruth Kaplan.
I actually want to go back to 1992, when I was just ending my time at Environmental Action and Clinton was running for president. And at that time, there was a big talk about building a green economy, and Clinton wanted some talking points. So he asked the environmental movement, what are your talking points on a green economy? And they said, well, we need solar, we need conservation, and we need to clean up all the crap. And I thought, So we have an economy based on planned obsolescence and manufactured need, and all we as an environmental community can say is this very narrow response to this question. So I left Environmental Action and, as Jill said, set up the Economics Working Group with a wonderful group of people in New York, another group down in DC. There were some labor economists, social psychologists, a whole variety, a bunch of radicals, to talk, and we talked for a couple of years. A group in New York and a group down in DC. And I was sort of, the scribe trying to fit all of these ideas together in some manner. And we ended up coming up with something called a General Agreement on a New Economy, GAIN, not GATT. And GATT was the first big world trade agreement. And we, in all of this discussion, suddenly one member of our group who'd worked for Representative Ron Dellums on single-payer health care, way back there, single-payer was being talked about, talked about this bill that Dellums had introduced, which he'd helped to write, based on a concept of community federalism, which was a very careful, clever way not to use the S word, the socialism word. It was community federalism. And it started with the local community, built up to regional functions and then to national functions. And I thought, oh, this is a framework that we could use to start thinking about a green economy. And so we played around with this. And as a part of it, I also thought about the visioning process that had happened in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where, one of the poorest cities in the country had gone through a very valid visioning process, come up with some ideas that all the consultants said couldn't work, and in fact, as a result of this visioning process, they did have a freshwater aquarium that's now hugely successful. They had, they saved an African American community that was supposed to be torn down by the expansion of a hospital. They built, created a battered women's shelter. So they did all of these things, and suddenly they were empowered through this process of visioning. Well, I thought, well, what happens if you think about the economy starting at the local community level with a visioning process like this, where you're not talking about the individual needs that drives the planned obsolescence and manufactured need by the corporations as they manipulate us, but rather what are the community needs? What if you really start talking about that? And then what if you talk about how you can begin to realize that? Where do you get the local capital from? You know, are there credit unions? Are there local currencies? Today I'd say, are there public banks? You know, how can you begin to create this local capital? And as you do this, you begin to create jobs that has meaning to the community because it's carrying out the vision. And what you end up with is, because you're really meeting real needs, then you don't have to buy as much stuff, right? I mean, you're playing music, you're doing these wonderful things that really feed our spirit. And you have increased social cohesion. You don't need as much money for the police. Maybe you don't even need them anymore. And again, you have creative outlets that have to do with being, not consuming. So you're creating an economy based on sufficiency, where if this works, you have work for all, you have a community based on wellness, and you have a community based on sustainability. And then you work from the local to what you do at the regional level. Well, there's been a lot of work done on green economic indicators. So as a result of all of this, you know, how is the region becoming sustainable? And what kind of regional trade do you want to reinforce this? And so what is the sustainability you're building as a region? And what kinds of functions at a regional level? How about training to do some of the kinds of jobs you need at the local level? So, you know, maybe some schools, you don't want every community to have, you know, training schools. That could be done at the regional level. What do you do at the national level? Well, you assess where you're going as a country on sustainability. You set standards, but you set standards using feedback from the local to the regional, not the corporate set standards that we have today. And most important is you fund sustainability, because one of my big concerns when in the 90s everybody was talking about sustainable communities, I thought, yeah, Winnetka, Illinois, sustainable, they have the money, they'll have wind power, they'll have solar, they'll have all these great things. How about the south side of Chicago? What's going to happen there? There has to be some redistribution of wealth. We know this. There has to be. So the idea that once a local community has their sustainability plan, then they get funds from the federal government. So this was a lot of fun. It was 2 years. It was exciting. I worked with wonderful people. And where are we today? You know, how do you begin to take a vision like that and make it into a reality? I think it's very important we start with a vision. We start with a vision that we can work with, so that whatever piece that we're working on, we have some idea of where we would like to go. So let's fast forward now to what's going on in Cleveland, Ohio, with the green economics model that they have for green worker co-ops, where, and you know, Gaurav Paravitz spoke, you know, the other night, and he's one of the people who's really helped to develop this. So you have anchor institutions, in this case the hospitals and the universities that aren't going anywhere, that can create the market for these green worker cooperatives. So there were agreements between the anchor institutions to actually buy the services and products that would be created by these worker co-ops. So first they did a green commercial laundry, minimizing the use of water and therefore energy. And then they did a business for solar and efficiency. And most recently they've done a business with these huge greenhouses on a previous brownfield to create salad greens and herbs. Again, the market was there. The workers aren't going anywhere. They're staying in Cleveland. The market is staying in Cleveland. And this is all based on the model from Mondragon. If you haven't heard of it, remember Mondragon. Check it out on your search engine when you go home and begin to read about Mondragon. Started in northeastern Spain soon after World War II. This whole model of worker co-ops and the banking to support it comes from Mondragon. It's been imported to the United States, and I think it's now a model that is beginning to move to many different communities, including some plans around DC. So it's spreading. It's very, very exciting. Very quickly, 3 other things I just want to touch on. Up in Maine, they're passing local laws that are saying these state and federal regulations saying how food has got to be produced and sold is done for agribusiness. It's not done for our local farms. If we follow these rules, we'll go out of business. We have a fundamental right to sell our chickens, to sell our crops to our neighbors and at our local farms. And it's based on my trust. You know me, I know you, and we trust. And if something isn't right, I'm going to say, hey, Richard, those greens weren't quite right. Can you do something about it? And you say, oh, okay, and we work it out. A whole different model about how to sell food and beginning to take on the federal regulations these towns in Maine are doing. The other thing, which I'll talk about much more in other workshops today, is rights-based law. And I'm sorry, I'm only going to touch on it now. And this is the concept really coming out of your work of fundamental rights. And the regulatory system is about regulating the bad. It's not about establishing fundamental rights for people, for communities, and for nature. And I got really excited about this work that started in central Pennsylvania, where farmers were taking on the CAFOs, where the whole progressive community was working with the governor to pass a law to regulate it. And these conservative, and listen to this word, Republican communities basically said, we don't want it regulated. We don't want any CAFOs here. We're going to protect our local farms. And that began a movement to pass rights-based laws. It can be on anything. I worked on it in water, starting again in a rather interesting small community up in New Hampshire. So we now have 6 towns in New Hampshire and Maine that have passed these laws on water. They've been passed on uranium mining. They've been passed on any number of issues. It's the structure into which you put it, not the specific issue you're fighting. And it's taking on corporations and saying, in our town, corporations have no constitutional rights. By matter of law in our town, corporations have no constitutional rights. It's not begging Congress to do something. It's taking on settled law. And then again, this went on to incorporate the rights of nature. Again, a small town in Pennsylvania, old mining town, passed this and said nature has rights. And then another town said not only does nature have rights, but if state or federal regulators or come and tell us we can't have this law, we're going to meet and we're going to think what we're going to do, because we're not going to let them say we can't do this. We are going to do it as a matter of right. The other thing, again, that's being talked about later is public banking. I don't want to talk about it now, but that's another piece. And so to sum up, what we need is we need a vision. We need local economic businesses based on worker rights. We need laws to establish the rights to self-governance and the rights of nature. We need to break up Wall Street stranglehold on all of us through public banks. And to quote Gar, It's important to build forward positively on all fronts over time, and in particular to self-consciously advance new wealth, democratizing, institution-building strategies that may add new forms of power along with new visions. He says to a politics of reform, I'd say to a politics of transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for that really beautiful summary and visioning process. Our next speaker is Richard Monhay, who's going to talk about labor rights and workers' rights and maybe immigrant rights as well. And Richard has certainly done something right to have earned a place here on an otherwise all-female panel. Congratulations to him for that. Very special. So he is the Vice President of Workers Unite, SEIU, which is a union very much in the forefront of fighting the attack on workers in the Midwest. And his work especially is in organizing low-wage workers, which is really almost everybody these days, an increasing, majority of the American population. And his real awakening came when he was shot by sheriffs following the Chicano moratorium. I don't know if we'll have time to hear about that, but I would love to hear more about that story. And he organized with Texas farm workers, with the IBEW, steel workers, and Workers United. He helped create the union's leadership school, where rank and file members take part in creating the political roadmap for the union. And he has long been active in the fight for immigrant rights. He is on the board of Move to Amend's leadership team, and he is Secretary of Labor for the Green Shadow Cabinet. So be welcome for Richard Monhay.
I'm slightly confused. Yesterday, they would only give us 2 minutes to speak, so I got in a 2-minute framework, and now I have 10 minutes, and I can really get lost there. No, I often wonder why I was asked to be a part of this panel, coming from labor and from sort of the front along the lines of the economic struggle. And I've thought about it, and I've thought about the TPP, and I went back and tried to get a sense of the trajectory of where we're at in our struggle, in all the fronts, and why I chose to be a part of Move to Amend and try to be a part of the Green Party is because I think that we're stuck in the past models of organizing and dealing with crisis and problems in our various communities, in our country, and in this hemisphere, but not only that, the world. And it's time, I think, that we absolutely, some of us rejected this some 30, 40 years ago. One of the things that led to my activity in Chicano moratorium is I grew up in East Los Angeles, and I had family on both sides of the border. And we traveled freely to visit my family, my aunts and uncles, and my grandmother's sister for decades. And then they tightened up on immigration. And my own experience in East Los Angeles in the high schools was that they would punish the students in elementary and junior high school after the Zoot Suit riots in East Los Angeles. And they wouldn't, they punished them for speaking Spanish in the schools. And there was no bilingual administrators, there was no bilingual teachers at that time, and certainly the high school and junior high school that I went to, Hollenbeck and Roosevelt. And we organized and led a strike of those schools that lasted for several weeks to get bilingual education, get bilingual administrators, and get bilingual teachers. And I learned a lot at that time. I was only 16, 17 years old, but I never let go of fighting wherever the fronts were. And as I grew up, I saw all the fronts. I lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and saw the battle on the Navajo Reservation, the Hopis, and various pueblos and what they were going through, the Cochiti, the lake that was built in the land of the Acoma Pueblo, and all the consequences that were going on. And clearly you get shaped and you get a certain experience and a certain look at the world. Over the last 30 or 40 years, increasingly we're shedding our naivete about capitalism, about democracy in the United States, and how it manifests itself in all its forms. And when I say hemisphere, we're directly connected to Mexico, Central America. And when I look at the battles in Brazil, in Venezuela, and Bolivia, and the conflicts and how they're connected to us, the indigenous peoples, the workers, the miners of Bolivia, the miners of Chile, the miners in our country that, where they get trapped, and then the consequences to our land, our communities, our families. It's clear that fighting in the old model, where we're all fighting on our various fronts, no longer works. And not only that, but that wresting concessions from the system, from the government, from the corporations, no longer works. And for some of us, it never worked. But for many of us, we also had hope that we could accomplish things. And because in some cases we did, whether it was civil rights, whether it was advance on the front of the struggle of women in unions, we did advance. And that just reinforced the idea that we could do something within the system. And I think we've gotten to the point where on all our fronts, all of our fronts, whether it's workers, in factories, in schools as teachers, everywhere, that we're being driven backward. Education for our children has been driven backward. The damage done to the environment, not just in the United States, but all over the world based upon our policies and the corporations of this country, put a great onus and responsibility on all of us. And I feel compelled, having built the organization that we have, the leadership structure in our union. We're a small organization. We're 20,000 members in the Midwest, but we feel compelled that we need to try to build the alliances, the organizations, and go through the difficult experience of disagreeing, arguing, and fighting. But out of that process, developing some kind of policy that links us together, not just in defending what we've got. We've got to do that, and we're going to do that. We're already doing that in all the various fronts, and I'm impressed with a lot that I'm hearing here about the battles that we have. And, I was looking at this little paper here, and it says Global Climate Convergence. And if there's anything that's been happening over the last few years and that I see happening in the next few years is exactly that, a convergence, a coming together of peoples from all the various fronts. And, what are we going to do with that? Well, we need to transform, but transform into what? And what are the steps of that transformation? And clearly one of the first steps is for us to come together and begin to agree on some kind of vision on how to take those next steps. Maybe all of us know, or maybe we're going to disagree where we want to end up. What kind of system? How will it work? What kind of democracy? Representative, participatory? There's a lot of debates and discussions that we need to have in terms of constructing a new model of what America can be. Not what it is, not what it's been, not accepting the least common denominator, the minimum for our children, the minimum for our family, the minimum for the air, the minimum for the world, the minimum for the indigenous peoples that are constantly driven into lands and then taken away or destroyed. There's a way of building that kind of transformation, but we got to take the convergence, the idea of transformation, and then begin to build the foundation. We need the schematics of the building. What do we begin with? And then where do we go? And clearly, the trade union movement that I represent must come to the table on these questions. There's an absolute disconnect between employed workers and the unemployed workers of the inner cities or Appalachia. You know, there was a recent report that came out. There's areas of West Virginia where 99% of the population of those towns, rural areas, live in absolute poverty. And we don't converse about that. We don't converse about the relationship of living in the inner city in housing that's dilapidated compared to living in the country, compared to having your community destroyed. And a part of that reflection is because we're all divided into different fronts. We're all divided in our fights, defending the little that we got, whether it's in one section of the country or one union or, one country. So I am looking at, and then, being put in a position to discuss whether or not I could be Secretary of Labor. And how do you create employment when employment is always in contradiction to the environment? But, and that's the perception in this country, that being environmentally safe will cost jobs.
Yes.
But it's a false dichotomy that we have in all our fronts of struggle, right? Workers getting better wages, living better, will cost you more. Shop at Walmart. On all of the questions, the solution and the narrative is always against the interests of our communities and absolutely in the interests of the corporations. And what is our narrative? What are our policy proposals? We know what we oppose, but what is our policy? What would be our governance? Not just on one area, not just on tar sands, but on jobs, on our communities. How do we live? What are those jobs going to be? Or maybe work is over. I was having a discussion. I was at Verizon. I had problems I had problems with my phone, and got into a conversation that I said I go to the supermarket and I.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I over?
You're just about at the
I'm
right
sorry.
time. Yeah, no, finish it up.
So we need to construct that convergence, that transformation, and certainly the organization and policies to go forward.
Thank you very much, Richard. And what he mentioned, this piece of paper here about the global climate convergence, this is an idea that has sort of been surfacing and is especially under discussion here at the conference about the panic, the mobilization of this moment around what's happening to the climate and what it means for everybody. There's no hiding from the climate. How it can be used to help bring us together around a fundamental movement for justice. How do we redefine that climate movement so that it really is about people, peace, and the planet, and not sort of dumbed down, as Ruth was saying, to sort of a very narrow set of goals. How do we make this really big and transformational? And in a way, as Richard said, that really integrates a sustainable, green, healthy economy and jobs with sustainability for the planet. And as he said, the myth that these are different things is exactly that. In fact, it's worse than a myth. It's purposeful deception intended to divide us so that we can be conquered. So, it's all about rejecting that, because there are, in fact, way more jobs that can be created through a sustainable and healthy economy. So I'm going to just put some of these here, and you can just pass them around and around, and I have some more as well. But yes, I think each of our speakers here deserves a day, at least, at the podium to share their incredible, vast wealth of knowledge and vision. So I really hate to be the timekeeper here. So our last speaker on the panel is my dear friend and running mate for life, Sherry whose story is well known. I won't spend too much time talking about it, except that Sherry found herself living in a car with her infant son and homeless and on the verge of freezing to death, and realizing that, wow, they're keeping the heat on in these homes so that the pipes won't freeze. You know, how about keeping the heat on in these homes so that the humans won't freeze? And she then liberated a home and got through the night and through the next couple of decades, and has helped so many, I think millions of people begin to liberate homes and realize that we have a right to housing as a human right, as we have a right to jobs and health and education. Sherry went on to co-found the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, which has been an incredible inspiration and real force to bring economic justice into our politics, into our communities, into our way of life. And Sherry also, in our campaign, we had a very an equal exchange. I taught Sherry how to eat blueberries, and she taught me how to get arrested all over the country. So with that, Sherry, if you could share some of your thoughts with us. Thank you.
So I have to stand up. I just arrived after driving all night from Philadelphia. Literally got here like a few seconds ago. You know, this damn global climate crisis thing that's happening, where, you know, it rains constantly and there's flash floods, and so I had a great time driving. But we also had to start late because just as an example of like how things are just collapsing in this country, there's a 3-year-old little boy that was just like dropped at my doorsteps from the Department of Human Services and Child Protection, and they said we'd be back in a day to 3 days. 9 days later, after several emergency calls each and every day, 5 to 7 calls a day, we had to go down to the Department of Human Services and remind them that this was a 3-year-old human being that needed someplace to go. And so they had an emergency court hearing yesterday before we got on the road. So basically the name of the game in this country right now is if you're not exploitable, you're absolutely expendable. And we're seeing that in regards to our children, and we're seeing that in regards to our seniors. You know, I've learned from my elders over the years that you know, if you don't use your mouth and you're not vocal, particularly if you're from this section of the population, you're just going to die. And that's pretty much where everybody I know is at right now, and that's why I stand up, because it's such a heavy emotional thing right now. Because for me, sometimes I feel like I came from Mars when I come into some of these various different rooms, because it's kind of like surreal when you live your life, your everyday life, not out of choice, in an emergency crisis room all the time. It's very difficult. You know, in Philadelphia, they say that we have more community gardens than any place in the entire country, and yet I live in a district in Kensington where we have some of the highest hunger rates in the entire country, and where 5 blocks from my house there's barbed wire around the food bank. And literally, you know, in my spare time at some point when I'm not running with Jill, no, I'm just kidding. You know, I'd like to just go around and just photograph everybody's refrigerator. Because I've yet to find anybody that has any food in it, and yet we have more community gardens, and we're doing a whole lot of greening, right? Well, that greening isn't translating into feeding people and ending hunger in this country. And Rich talked about earlier, this disconnect between creating jobs and keeping people alive, and it's always in contradiction with the environment, right? Definitely during our campaign, I did tried to go on this campaign talking about turning the Rust Belt into the Green Belt, right? And I heard over and over and over again, this question of jobs. Well, how am I going to feed my family? And so it was really exciting to be able to run on a platform that embraced the Green New Deal. And, I could talk forever about that and feel very passionate about that. But the other thing that we've had to begin to do across the country with the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign is because we can't really afford to just sit and wait until these various different policy changes happen. Either we teach people how to take over abandoned properties and house themselves, and this question of a fight for land, and reclaim the land in order to grow food, in order to feed people, then people are not going to be fed. People are not going to be housed, and these things are not going to happen. And we're doing these things as we're teaching people how to fight, and developing their political education in this process. It's similar to boot camp. I know people don't like to use analogies that are similar to war, but pretty much if you're living in a community where the National Guard's driving around and boarding up abandoned houses, where you have 27 schools that have closed, they've eliminated the entire budget except to have a principal and a police officer, and where they're closing your fire departments in your neighborhood, it's pretty similar to war situation. I definitely know our children suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder when they have to map out how to walk to school, because there is no such thing as safety and security, because the number one source of income in my community used to be welfare, and now it's drugs. And with employment leaving, never coming back ever again in this neighborhood, and where the seniors are trying to get the jobs at McDonald's and Wendy's versus the teenagers, it's a very difficult situation that we're dealing with. But so one of the other responses besides just encouraging people to build human rights cities and reclaiming these economic, social, and cultural rights, not just talking about these things, and that's why we have a wonderful, growing, alive membership, is because if we sat in a room with hungry people and didn't figure out how to address their hunger or feed their kids, talk about a dying small membership. But because we understand that we have to deal with some of those basic necessities of life while we develop those generals in the process, we're really a growing membership across the entire country. But we've also been a part of a process of forming together a coalition called the Campaign to Take Back Vacant Land. Now, in the original days, we were very excited by this because we figured we would get together and we would fight for community land trust, right? And then, our good old Democrats came along and came up with a term of ensuring that there was councilmatic prerogative. In other words, please let us as city council people sit down and talk with the developers and the speculators. We come up with a deal, and if what the community wants isn't in conflict to that, under the guise of using a coalition of people to fight for land trusts, we'll secure some land, or we'll secure a couple houses, or we'll stop a Walmart from coming into our community. So we're having to be very careful about these various different alignments that are being developed across the entire country. We were terrified about a month ago when we were alerted to the fact that Philadelphia has been chosen to have a national conference sponsored by Bank of America with progressive organizations in Philadelphia to talk about what to do with vacant housing in this country. We didn't think it was any accident that they chose Philly to have this national conference around what to do with. So, of course, we're in conversation with homeless families and plan to go in on August 20th and let Bank of America know what we think the national plan should be around what to do with vacant properties. Maybe we could end homelessness in America. They could start with that by housing everybody. The last thing I want to say is also, I think it was like a couple months ago, everything was so much, is that we went on a march from Philadelphia to the Chamber of Commerce. Usually in the anti-poverty world, we've spent our lives wasting our time by marching to the halls of Congress and sitting down and being like, please, I'm losing my home, or I can't eat, or my child doesn't have any health care, or would you do something about the job crisis? And of course, absolutely nothing has happened forever. Except for, we were able to give, maybe free sandwiches from our various different elected officials and, spend our already small amounts of money from our impoverished movement. So this time around,
A plate of cookies.
yeah, a plate of cookies. I mean, this time around, we're finally beginning to mature, and it's as a result of what's happening out here in the world, but it's also because we're getting serious about really understanding what it is that we're dealing with. And so we started Operation Green Jobs in Philadelphia, where we marched from our farm in Kensington to the Chamber of Commerce, because they're the folks that are really in charge in this process. And I guess we should have been surprised, but we've organized very large marches before 5,000 to 10,000 people, and we only had this small group of folks in front of the Chamber of Commerce. But they made it clear to us that that was far more important than the White House or any place else. So it seems like we're getting clearer about who it is that we're really up against when it comes to corporate America, really controlling our elected officials, and that we have to really continue in our work to build an independent political movement in this country.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I'm just going to say a really quick word about health rights. I promised Nancy that I wouldn't let the subject go completely neglected as we're talking about the rights that create the foundation of a new society and a new planet and a new economy. I'll just really quick, less than 30 seconds here, that health rights are critical to justice, to an economy that works. And the good news, if we move to a healthcare as a human rights system, Medicare for all, it saves us money. It doesn't cost us money, it will save us trillions of dollars. This is the best way to solve the so-called debt and deficit problem, not through austerity, but actually through a Medicare for all healthcare plan. And the second point is that in moving to a green economy, it turns out that is probably the biggest single thing that we could do for our health as well. And there's a living example of that in the form of Cuba. When their oil pipeline went down in the early 1990s, and there are scholarly studies written up about this in the Journal of Epidemiology, when Cuba had to move to a green economy, and they quickly, because they didn't have any oil coming over from the old Soviet Union and all the goodies that came with it, so they had to quickly, feed people. And they didn't have oil to drive cars and trucks or the tractors for the farms. They got out a lot of people. There's plenty of work to do, actually, if we were to have a green economy. They got out the draft animals, they went to work, they created a green agriculture system overnight. They also lost all of their air pollution overnight. And they created an active transportation system where people had to walk and bike and take buses and things like that. So what happened almost immediately, within 2 years, you could see their rates of obesity were cut by 50%, their death rates from diabetes went down 50%, their death rates from heart attacks and strokes went down 20 to 35%. All of this by spending $0. We spend almost $3 trillion a year. That's 3 times as much as what we spend on the military industrial security complex. This is like the biggest expense in our lives and in our economy on healthcare, but it's not healthcare, it's sick care. It's mostly handouts to pharmaceuticals and medical insurance and device companies and so on. So, you know, we can move to a healthy green economy and it pays for itself. Recent study done out of Stanford by a guy named Mark Jacobson, who's an engineer, looked at the state of New York, excuse me, as a microcosm and did a detailed economic analysis and found that you save so much money through diseases averted that you can actually pay for the whole green economic transition and for the construction of all the new transportation and fossil fuel replacements. So you can go 100% renewable, 100% wind, water, and sun by the year 2030. In other words, in time to avert the climate crisis and wind up economically ahead. It doesn't cost you a penny because of all the health you create and the sickness you avert. So it's another win-win. Quickly, I want to open it up to questions, and I apologize we don't have more time. What maybe we can do is just have a series of questions stated, if we could have maybe 5 or 6 people, however many, and then give the panel a minute to respond to the group of the questions, a minute or 2. So in 30 seconds or less? Yeah.
Yes, I'm really excited about this new Green Deal, but I live in Colorado, and I was wondering if your group traveled there, or do you have a local people to be presenting the Green Deal in different states?
Great, okay. Other? Yeah.
What part does a spiritual community play on this? Because I think we should enlist every Protestant church in this country and teach them how to pray. Teach them how to pray about humans as giving, loving people, and convert that spiritual order. What do you think of that?
Thank you.
I noticed you say dirty fuel extraction. I was young. I watched as they used dirty iron ore extraction. And I was at Two Islands when they created the Taconite Tailings Pond. And a thunderstorm came by. The wall, the dam that was supposed to contain the Taconite Tailings didn't. It floated to Lake Superior, ruined the greatest freshwater lake in the world, the largest smelt, the largest herring, etc. I was there at the time, and now I am asking, I'm a retired cancer researcher, okay? I am asking that we create a state bank of Wisconsin, like the state bank of North Dakota, take the money power away from Wall Street and the New York bankers and give it to the local people so we can control our own lives. Period.
Hi, I'm Alice Rochelle. I'll be talking on Saturday. I am the founder of the Boulder Municipalization Movement, and I love this convergence idea, and I want, it's so right on, and everything you guys have said is so right on, and we're trying to make that happen as a pilot for America and Boulder. We've got the labs and everybody to do that. I want to hear 30 seconds from each one of you. What do you need from me?
Yeah.
I want to tell me what you need from me, because I will take it back to my community and we'll do what we can to move this forward.
30 seconds.
Well, okay, I'm going to put that in the pile here. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm part of a group in Madison that's works with the homeless people. We've sent something to the county. It's a homeless bill of rights. We're trying to get that ratified so homeless people have some type of protection from arbitrary police harassment, among other things. And one thing I'd be curious to know is if anything's being done on a national front to get something that would give these people some protection.
Great. Great, thank you. And maybe two more if there are, and then we'll just take 1 minute here of response. Yeah.
Well, I would echo what she said. I was going to ask the question of Gar's book, what then must we do? Because
Right.
we are at the point where we know the problems. We've been immersed in them for many years now. We know the writing problems. We agree about the purpose. What steps can we take within our communities? I'm from North Carolina, and we've got a life and death battle going on there.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so maybe if we each take, can we go over 5 minutes?
Yes.
All right, so 1 minute each of us, and pick what you'd like to respond to, or more generally to, the thrust of the questions.
So I think the one I'll respond to is what would I like to see more people doing? And from my vantage point, I think that we all need to get a lot more strategic and goal-oriented with our systemic vision on how to achieve what we're all putting out there. Because the one-shot wonders, calling the media and then getting 150 people arrested, or right now Credo has 70,000 people signed up to get arrested, which, is an interesting thing, but getting arrested one day in front of a state house does not shut down the corporate machines, and they are the weak spots. They are the source of it. And so from my work, after 17 years of being part of the environmental movement, I think we really need to up the ante, get very strategic in where we're going to put our human resource and where we're going to put our brain power, and make sure that every single thing we do is going to take down the machine.
Yes.
Nice, beautiful. Thank you, Lauren. Sherry.
Well, I think that there are many aspects of this that come together for all of us. I love the convergence terminology. In fact, we just had a convergence ceremony where there were people from all over the world that came to address some of these issues. And I think that that kind of also ties into your question about what role does spiritual practice play in this. And I think that if you look at, no matter where you come from, what your background is, there is some terminology about stewardship to the earth in almost all religious doctrine. And so really tying that in to the work that's being done on the local level, I think is really important, that there's a role to play there. But what I think is maybe more important for the larger movement is learning how to fight them where they're weakest, because we're not going to get press coverage for 70,000 people getting arrested. That's not going to happen. We're not going to get press coverage when 10% of the population, native population, is dying in a small community because of fracking. So we need to become really, really strategic and coordinated in our efforts to address these issues. And I think that's the first step, is really getting sophisticated about that.
Thank you, Sherry. Ruth.
Yeah, I'd like to also address what can we be doing back home, and just say that for me, where I've ended up is organizing for a public bank, because I think that's cracking open the system. And I think that given that there's the only public bank in the country is in North Dakota, gives us some cover. I'm just waiting for Congress to say public bank, and I'll say North Dakota. But it
90 years for them to create another public bank. It's about time Wisconsin did it.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's locally what I'm really working on now. I think it also gives an opportunity to finance, to create money for local businesses, green businesses.
Beautiful. Thank you, Ruth. Richard.
In 1972, 73, I think his name was Lewis Powell, who went on to become, went on to the Supreme Court. He wrote a document for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and it was like a clarion call that the country was headed in the wrong direction, and that the revolutionaries and the communists were beginning to take over the country. And set out a plan to redirect that. And that plan in detail you know, was to take over the media, take over the government, and they accomplished it. They had a vision, they had a plan, and they knew how to do it. And all I can say is there was an earthquake in San Francisco back about 13, 14 years ago during the World Series. And after the earthquake, you know, in San Francisco, they got these roads one on top of each other, and they collapsed in, and there was people trapped in their cars. And the firemen or the rescuers couldn't get out there, you know, because there was rubble everywhere, right? And so the helicopter was flying around, and you know, where these collapsed roads were, and you could see people climbing through the rubble to try to get in there to save those people. Nobody organized them. There were communities that self-organized themselves in a time of crisis. And when they went in there, I'm sure they didn't ask who had documents. Or, you know, are you white or are you black? We're only going to help the white people here. No, the natural impulse of the American people is to save each other. And we're in crisis. We're in crisis, and we can do this.
All right.
I would say that we have the World Court of Women on Poverty and Homelessness that's coming up October 18th, 19th, and 20th in Philadelphia. It's an expose of what's not working in this country. And it has jurors that are going to determine who's responsible and what needs to be done about it. And it's incredibly important because many times when we have some of these conversations, the people that are impacted by these issues are not in the room.
Yeah.
And so I think it's time for us to embrace the people that are impacted by these issues and make sure that they're in the room. So gather the stories of people in your community and attend the World Court on Poverty in Philadelphia. If you can't come, look at our website at economichumanrights.org and send us those stories and your money.
And I'll just add to that, on the flyer here about the climate convergence, which we're calling a global climate convergence, because it's time to get out of our silos, and it's time to transcend the artificial borders of nation states that are also used to divide us. 2 million people got out around the world to stop GMOs for that one issue alone. But people know that we're not going to live just by stopping GMOs. There's a whole other agenda for people, peace, and the planet. If you put us all together, it would be staggering. So the idea is to have these series of conferences where we actually develop what is the agenda, what is the blueprint, what are our demands, effectively, because power concedes nothing without them. We put together that agenda, that vision, and the blueprint at these conferences, which are tentatively, we're targeting Earth Day to May Day of 2014, connecting the planet and the people. A series of conferences followed in perhaps by 6 months in a day or week or perhaps a month of direct action, of global direct actions, which have a specific purpose and an agenda to show how powerful we are so that we can actually stand up and claim the power that we already have to put people, peace, and the planet back on track and to save our future. It's in our hands, and we'll do it together. Thank you all so much.